The frozen body lay crumpled at the river's edge like a discarded doll, and Zachary Rawlings almost rode past before the moonlight caught the pale gleam of a hand against the dark stones. He reined in his horse sharply, the animal's breath misting in the bitter January air of 1878. The wind howling down from the mountains of Colorado Territory cut through his heavy coat as he dismounted, boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. Zachary had been riding for 3 days straight from Denver, pushing hard to reach the small settlement of Fairplay before the worst of winter set in, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the same instinct that had kept him alive through 4 years of war and a decade of drifting afterward. Or maybe it was just dumb luck. The figure was small, definitely female, wearing a thin cotton dress that had been soaked through and was now stiff with ice. Her dark hair had frozen in twisted strands across her face, and her lips had gone blue. Zachary dropped to his knees beside her, yanking off his glove to press 2 fingers against her throat. There, faint as a whisper, he felt a pulse. "Christ Almighty," he muttered, already shrugging out of his coat. He wrapped it around her and lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, and he could feel her bones through the thin fabric of her dress. He'd seen enough death to know she was close to it now, closer than most people ever came and lived to tell about. His horse, a reliable bay gelding named Copper, stood steady as Zachary carefully mounted with the woman in his arms. He couldn't ride hard with her like this, but he remembered passing an abandoned trapper's cabin about a mile back. It would have to do. The ride seemed to take forever, even though it was just minutes. The woman's breathing was so shallow he had to keep checking to make sure she was still alive. When the cabin finally appeared, a dark shadow against the snow-covered hillside, Zachary felt a surge of relief. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but the structure looked sound enough. Inside, the cabin was dusty and filled with old cobwebs, but it was shelter. More importantly, there was a stone fireplace with a stack of wood that had been left behind. Zachary laid the woman down as gently as he could on the dirt floor, then set about building a fire with practiced efficiency. His hands shook slightly as he struck the flint, though whether from cold or fear for this stranger's life, he couldn't say. The fire caught, small flames growing into a proper blaze. Zachary pulled the woman closer to the warmth, but not too close. He'd seen frostbite before and knew that warming someone too quickly could be just as dangerous as the cold itself. He spread his bedroll out and carefully positioned her on it, then went back outside to tend to Copper and retrieve his supplies. When he returned with his saddlebags, the firelight had brightened the cabin considerably. He could see the woman more clearly now. She looked young, maybe 20 or so, with a heart-shaped face and features that would have been pretty if they weren't so deathly pale. Her dress was of decent quality, not the rough homespun most frontier women wore, but it was torn in several places and stained with mud and what might have been blood. Zachary knew he needed to get her out of the wet clothes, but propriety warred with necessity. In the end, survival won. He turned his back as he worked, trying to preserve what dignity he could for her, replacing the frozen dress with his spare shirt and wrapping her in both blankets he owned. Her skin was like ice to the touch, and he worried he'd found her too late. He boiled water over the fire and tried to get some of the warm liquid past her lips, but she remained unconscious. All he could do was wait and keep the fire going and pray that whatever God might be listening would see fit to let this woman live. The night stretched on endlessly. Zachary dozed in fits and starts, always waking to check on his unexpected charge, to add wood to the fire, to listen for the sound of her breathing. Sometime near dawn, as the first gray light began filtering through the gaps in the cabin walls, he heard her moan. Zachary was at her side immediately. Her eyelids fluttered, and he saw her eyes were a striking shade of green, like new leaves in spring. They focused on him with confusion and fear. "Easy now," he said softly, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "You're safe. I found you by the river, half frozen. You're going to be all right." She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a croak. Zachary held the cup of water to her lips, supporting her head as she drank. She took a few sips, then fell back, exhausted by even that small effort. "My name's Zachary Rawlings," he told her. "What's yours?" Her lips moved, and he had to lean close to hear. "Teresa," she whispered. "Teresa Voss." "Well, Miss Voss, you gave me quite a scare. Can you tell me what happened? How'd you end up in that river?" Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her temples. "The wagon," she said. "It overturned. The current was so strong. My father, my mother, my brother, they're gone, all gone." Zachary's chest tightened with sympathy. He'd lost his own family to cholera when he was barely 16, his whole world wiped out in the space of a week. He knew that kind of grief, the way it could hollow you out and leave you empty. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I'm truly sorry." She closed her eyes, more tears escaping. "I tried to save them. I tried to reach my mother, but the water pulled me under. When I came up, they were gone. The wagon was gone. I made it to the bank, but I couldn't find them. I searched until I couldn't walk anymore." That explained the state he'd found her in. She'd probably been suffering from exhaustion and exposure for hours before she collapsed. "You need to rest now," Zachary said. "Build your strength back up. We can talk more later." But Teresa's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "You have to help me find them, please. Maybe they made it out. Maybe they're hurt somewhere, waiting for help." Zachary looked into those desperate green eyes and knew what he had to tell her, knew how much it would hurt. "Miss Voss, that river's running high and fast with snowmelt. The temperature last night dropped well below freezing. If they went into the water—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "No," she said, but there was no conviction in it. She knew the truth as well as he did. Her fingers loosened on his wrist, and she turned her face away. "We were heading to California. Papa heard there was good land to be had, opportunities. We left St. Louis 6 months ago. We were so close to making it through the mountains before the worst of winter." Zachary said nothing, just sat with her in her grief. There were no words that could make this better, nothing he could say that would bring her family back. So he just stayed there, a silent presence in the darkness of her loss. Eventually, she fell back into an exhausted sleep. Zachary watched her for a long moment, this stranger who had stumbled into his life in the most tragic way possible. He was a drifter, had been since the war ended. He owned nothing but his horse, his gun, and the clothes on his back. He had no business getting tangled up in anyone else's troubles. But looking at Teresa's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her fingers clutched at the blanket even in sleep, he knew he couldn't just leave her. His mother would have boxed his ears for even considering it. When full daylight came, Zachary left Teresa sleeping and went out to search the riverbank. He found the place where she must have pulled herself out, saw the drag marks in the mud, now frozen solid. He followed the river for 2 miles in each direction, looking for any sign of the wagon or the other members of the Voss family. He found the wagon about a mile downstream, or what was left of it. The current had smashed it against a stand of rocks, reducing it to kindling. Scattered along the bank were the remnants of a life, a trunk with clothes spilling out, a dented cooking pot, a child's wooden toy, but no bodies. The river had taken them, and it wasn't giving them back. Zachary gathered what he could salvage, though it wasn't much. At least he found a dress that looked like it might fit Teresa, and a coat that was waterlogged but still intact. He also found a leather portfolio that had somehow gotten wedged between 2 rocks. Inside were documents, land deeds, letters, a small amount of money. When he returned to the cabin, Teresa was awake, sitting up and looking considerably better than she had hours before. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes were clearer, though they held a depth of sorrow that hurt to see. "You went looking," she said. It wasn't a question. Zachary set down the salvaged items and nodded. "Found the wagon downstream. These were all I could recover." Teresa's hands shook as she went through the items. She picked up the wooden toy, a small carved horse, and held it to her chest. "This was Thomas's, my little brother. He was only 8. Her voice broke on the words. "I'm sorry I couldn't find them to give them a proper burial," Zachary said. "You saved my life," Teresa replied, looking up at him. "If you hadn't found me, I'd be dead too. Thank you for that, Mr. Rawlings. Just Zachary is fine, and you don't need to thank me. Any decent person would have done the same." "You'd be surprised," she said softly. "Decency isn't as common as you might think." They spent the rest of the day at the cabin. Teresa was still too weak to travel, and Zachary wasn't about to push her. He shot a rabbit and made a stew, forcing her to eat even though she claimed she wasn't hungry. She needed food to build her strength back up. As the second night fell, they talked. Teresa told him about her family, about her father who had been a shopkeeper in St. Louis, about her mother who made the best apple pie Teresa had ever tasted, about Thomas who loved horses and had been so excited to see the mountains. Zachary found himself talking too, more than he had in years. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his family, about the war. He didn't tell her everything, couldn't bring himself to speak about some of the things he'd seen and done, but he told her enough that she got a picture of who he was. "So you're just drifting," Teresa said. "No destination, no home to go back to." "That's about the size of it," Zachary agreed. "Been doing it for 10 years now, never seemed like a reason to stop." "That sounds lonely," she said quietly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it's simple. No ties, no responsibilities, just me and the next horizon." Teresa was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I don't know what I'm going to do now," she finally said. "I have no family left, no home. The money Papa was carrying is gone with him. All I have is what you found." Zachary had been thinking about this. "There's a town called Fairplay about 15 miles west of here. It's small but decent enough. I'm sure there are folks there who could help you figure things out. Will you take me there?" she asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice that made his chest tight. "Of course," he said. "Soon as you're strong enough to ride." 2 more days passed before Zachary judged Teresa fit for travel. In that time, they fell into an easy rhythm. Zachary hunted and tended to copper while Teresa mended her salvaged clothes and organized the few possessions that remained. They talked for hours, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. Zachary found himself noticing things about Teresa that had nothing to do with her being a person in need of help. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The soft sound of her laugh when he told a funny story about his army days. The grace in her movements as she grew stronger. He tried to tamp down those thoughts. Teresa had just lost everything. The last thing she needed was some drifter cowboy developing feelings for her. But it was getting harder to ignore the way his heart lifted when she smiled at him, or the way he found excuses to stay close to her. For her part, Teresa seemed to find comfort in his presence. She stayed near him when they were both in the cabin, and more than once he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. On the morning they were set to leave, Teresa dressed in the salvaged clothes. The dress fit reasonably well, if a bit loose, and the coat would keep her warm enough for the ride. Zachary had fashioned a sort of sling from blankets that would let her ride in front of him on copper. "Ready?" he asked as he helped her mount. "As I'll ever be," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. They rode slowly, Zachary keeping Copper to an easy walk. Teresa sat in front of him, her back pressed against his chest, and he tried not to think about how right it felt to have her there. The day was clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue overhead. "Zachary," Teresa said after they'd been riding for an hour, "when we get to Fairplay, what will you do? Keep drifting?" "That was the plan," he said. "Was?" she asked, picking up on his choice of words. Zachary was quiet for a moment. "I don't know any more," he admitted. "Meeting you, it's made me think about things differently, made me wonder if maybe there's more to life than just moving from place to place." Teresa turned her head slightly, enough that he could see her profile. "I've been thinking too," she said, "about what comes next for me. I realized something these past few days. I don't want to be alone. I don't want to lose anyone else I care about." "That's understandable," Zachary said. "But I also realized that caring about people, having connections, that's what makes life worth living. Even knowing the pain that can come from loss, I wouldn't trade the years I had with my family for anything." Zachary understood what she was saying. He'd spent 10 years avoiding connections, avoiding the possibility of loss. But in doing so, he'd also avoided the possibility of love, of belonging, of having a real life. They reached Fairplay as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The town was small, maybe 24 buildings clustered around a main street, but it looked peaceful and settled. Zachary rode directly to the boarding house, a 2-story structure that looked well maintained. The proprietor was a widow named Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She took one look at Teresa and immediately began fussing over her, ushering her inside and promising hot food and a warm bed. "You'll stay too, of course," Mrs. Henderson said to Zachary. "Any man who'd help a lady in distress is welcome under my roof." That night, after Teresa had been fed and settled into a room, Zachary sat in the boarding house parlor with Mrs. Henderson. He explained what had happened, leaving out some of the more painful details. "Poor child," Mrs. Henderson said, shaking her head. "To lose everything like that. But she's lucky you found her, Mr. Rawlings. The good Lord must have put you on that road for a reason." Zachary wasn't sure he believed in that kind of divine providence, but he didn't argue. "I was wondering if you might know of any work around town," he said. "For Miss Voss, I mean. She'll need a way to support herself." "Well, now that you mention it, the schoolteacher just got married and moved to Denver with her new husband. The town's been looking for a replacement. Miss Voss seems educated enough. Do you think she could teach?" "I think she could do just about anything she set her mind to," Zachary said, and realized he meant it. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new pattern. Teresa met with the town council and was offered the teaching position, which she accepted gratefully. The school was a small one-room building, and she had about 15 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Zachary, meanwhile, found work at the local stable. The owner, a gruff man named Pete Carlson, needed help with the horses and was impressed by Zachary's skills. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and it gave Zachary a reason to stay in Fairplay. He told himself he was just staying until Teresa was properly settled, that he'd move on once he was sure she was all right. But weeks turned into months, and he found he had no desire to leave. He and Teresa saw each other often. He'd stop by the schoolhouse sometimes, watching from the doorway as she taught her students with patience and warmth. She'd come to the stable in the evenings and they'd walk through town together, talking about their days. The people of Fairplay began to notice. Small towns always did. There were whispers and knowing looks, especially from the older women who considered matchmaking their sacred duty. But Zachary and Teresa pretended not to notice. both dancing around the feelings that were growing increasingly difficult to ignore. Spring came to the Colorado mountains in a rush of melting snow and wildflowers. The aspens leafed out in brilliant green, and the meadows erupted in color. One Sunday afternoon, Zachary invited Teresa on a picnic, packing supplies from the general store and borrowing horses from Pete. They rode out to a meadow Zachary had discovered, a place where a creek rang clear and cold and the mountains rose up on all sides like protective walls. Teresa gasped when she saw it. "It's beautiful," she said, dismounting, "like something from a dream." They spread a blanket and ate cold chicken and fresh bread and strawberries that had cost Zachary half a week's wages. Teresa lay back on the blanket, looking up at the clouds drifting across the sky. "I've been happy here," she said. "Happier than I thought I could be after losing my family. The children at school, the people in town, they've all been so kind." "They're good people," Zachary agreed, lying down beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. "And you," Teresa continued, "you've been the best part, Zachary. I don't think I could have survived this, emotionally I mean, without you." Zachary's heart was pounding. "Teresa, I need to tell you something. I've been trying not to say anything, didn't want to presume or make things complicated, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." She turned her head to look at him, those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for months now fixed on his face. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out. "Hell, I think I started falling that first night in the cabin, watching you sleep and praying you'd wake up. Every day since then, it's just gotten stronger. I know the timing might not be right, that you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know." Teresa was quiet for a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then she reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I feel the same way," she said softly. "I have for weeks now. I was afraid to say anything, afraid that you'd think I was just confused or grateful or looking for someone to replace what I lost. But that's not it at all. What I feel for you, Zachary, it's real and it's separate from everything that happened before." Zachary squeezed her hand, relief and joy flooding through him. "Are you sure? I'm just a stable hand, Teresa. I don't have much to offer." "You have yourself," she said. "That's everything." He leaned over and kissed her then, a soft press of lips that sent warmth flooding through his entire body. She kissed him back, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "I love you," Teresa whispered. "I love you too," Zachary replied. They spent the rest of the afternoon in that meadow, talking about the future instead of the past for the first time. Zachary told her about his dream of having a small ranch someday, a place to raise horses and build a life. Teresa told him about wanting a family, about the fear she'd been carrying that she'd never have that chance after losing the family she was born into. "We could build that life together," Zachary said carefully. "If you wanted. I know it's fast, but I'm not a young man anymore, Teresa. I'm 32 and I've wasted enough time drifting. I want to put down roots. I want to do it with you." "I want that too," Teresa said. "More than anything." They rode back to town as the sun was setting, hands clasped together between their horses. When they reached the boarding house, Zachary helped Teresa dismount, then pulled her close for another kiss. "I'll talk to Pete tomorrow," he said. "See if he knows of any land for sale around here. It won't be much at first, but we can build it up together." "I don't need much," Teresa said. "I just need you." The next months were a whirlwind of activity. Pete, it turned out, owned a plot of land about 5 miles outside of town that he'd been meaning to sell. When he heard about Zachary's plans, he offered it at a price Zachary could afford with his savings and a loan from the bank. It was 40 acres of decent grazing land with a creek running through it, and a stand of timber for building. Zachary proposed to Teresa properly one evening in the parlor of the boarding house, presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. Teresa said yes with tears streaming down her face, and Mrs. Henderson, who had been eavesdropping shamelessly, burst into the room with congratulations and began planning the wedding immediately. They were married in late June of 1879, a year and a half after Zachary had found Teresa by the river. The whole town turned out for the celebration at the small church. Teresa wore a dress made by the local seamstress, white with delicate embroidery, and carried wildflowers from the meadow where Zachary had first told her he loved her. Standing at the altar, watching Teresa walk toward him, Zachary felt a completeness he'd never experienced before. This woman, who had come into his life in such a tragic way, had become his entire world. When she reached him and took his hand, he saw the same depth of feeling reflected in her eyes. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Zachary barely heard the rest. All his attention was focused on Teresa, on the promises they were making to each other, on the life they were beginning together. When he kissed her as his wife for the first time, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Zachary pulled back and grinned at her, and she laughed, the sound like music. They spent their first night as husband and wife at the small cabin Zachary had been building on their land. It wasn't finished yet, just 2 rooms and a roof, but it was theirs. Teresa walked through it, touching the walls Zachary had built with his own hands, looking out the window at the view of the mountains. "It's perfect," she said. "It's a start," Zachary replied, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "We'll add on as we need to. Build it into a real home." Teresa turned in his arms and kissed him. "It's already a real home," she said. "Home is wherever we're together." That night they made love for the first time, a sweet and tender joining that left them both breathless and clinging to each other. Afterward, lying in their bed with Teresa curled against his side, Zachary thought about how different his life was now from just 18 months ago. He'd been so alone then, so adrift. Now he had a wife, a home, a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. The next years were busy ones. Zachary continued working at Pete's stable while also building up their ranch. He started with half a dozen horses, carefully selected, and bred them with patience and skill. Teresa continued teaching during the school year, her students adoring her and the parents grateful for her dedication. In the spring of 1881, Teresa discovered she was pregnant. She told Zachary one evening after supper, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "There's a baby in there," she said, her eyes shining with joy and a little fear. Zachary felt tears spring to his own eyes. "A baby," he repeated, the reality of it overwhelming. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Teresa asked. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," he said, pulling her close. "I'm terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely breathe." Teresa laughed through her own tears. "That's exactly how I feel." As her pregnancy progressed, Zachary became increasingly protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the ranch, wouldn't let her lift anything heavier than a book, drove Mrs. Henderson crazy with his constant questions about what Teresa should and shouldn't be doing. "She's having a baby, not dying of consumption, Mrs. Henderson finally told him in exasperation. "Women have been doing this since Eve. She'll be fine." But Zachary couldn't help worrying. Teresa was his whole world, and the thought of anything happening to her terrified him in a way nothing else ever had. Their son was born in December of 1881. A healthy boy with a strong set of lungs and his mother's green eyes. They named him Thomas after Teresa's little brother, and when Teresa held their son for the first time, tears streaming down her face, Zachary knew she was thinking of the family she'd lost. They would have loved him, Zachary said softly. They would have, Teresa agreed. I wish they could have met him. Tell him about them, Zachary said. Tell him stories about his grandparents and his uncle. Keep their memory alive that way. And she did. As Thomas grew, Teresa told him tales of his grandfather, the shopkeeper, his grandmother who made the best apple pie, his young uncle who loved horses. The stories became part of the fabric of their family, a way of honoring those who had been lost. Thomas was followed by a daughter, Mary, in 1883, and another son, Joseph, in 1886. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, gaining rooms and a proper second story. The ranch flourished as well. Zachary's skill with horses became known throughout the region, and people would travel from as far as Denver to buy his stock. Teresa eventually stopped teaching to focus on raising their children, but she never stopped being an educator. She taught all three of them to read by the time they were 4, filled their heads with poetry and mathematics and history. The Rawlings children were known as the smartest in Fairplay, and Zachary and Teresa were proud. Life wasn't without its challenges. There were hard winters when they worried about money, summers when drought threatened the ranch, illnesses that kept them up at night praying their children would recover. But they faced everything together, their partnership strengthened by each obstacle overcome. One night, when Thomas was 12 and the younger children were asleep, Zachary and Teresa sat on the porch of their home, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. It was a ritual they'd maintained through the years, this quiet time together after the children were in bed. "Do you ever think about that night?" Teresa asked. "When you found me by the river?" "All the time," Zachary admitted. "I think about how close I came to riding past, to never even seeing you there. What would have happened if I'd made camp an hour earlier, or if the moon hadn't been out?" "I don't like to think about that," Teresa said with a shiver. "But sometimes I wonder if there wasn't some kind of divine plan. My family's death was a tragedy, and I still grieve for them, but without that tragedy, I never would have met you. We wouldn't have this life, these children. Your mother used to say that God writes straight with crooked lines," Zachary said, remembering one of the stories she'd told him. "She did," Teresa confirmed. "I think maybe she was right. The path that led us to each other was painful and terrible, but I can't regret where it brought me." "Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Zachary said firmly. "It makes you human. We can grieve what was lost and still be grateful for what we found. Those things can exist together." Teresa reached over and took his hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after all their years together. "I love you, Zachary Rawlings. More today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." "That's my line," Zachary said with a smile. It was something he'd said to her on their first anniversary, and it had become a tradition between them. "I'm stealing it," Teresa said, smiling back. "Sue me." Zachary laughed and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. They sat like that for a long time, comfortable in each other's presence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. As the years passed, the Rawlings family became a fixture in Fairplay. Zachary served on the town council, using his voice to advocate for better schools and roads. Teresa started a small library in their home that was open to the community, her love of learning shared freely with anyone who wanted it. Their children grew strong and happy, secure in the knowledge that they were loved. Thomas, when he was old enough, began working with his father on the ranch, showing the same natural talent with horses that Zachary had. Mary proved to be a gifted artist, her sketches and paintings decorating the walls of their home. Joseph, the youngest, was the scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book, asking questions that made even Teresa have to think. In 1895, when Zachary was 49 and Teresa was 37, they celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary with a small party attended by close friends and family. Pete Carlson, now elderly and retired, gave a rambling toast about how he'd known from the start that Zachary was a good man. "Never seen anyone work as hard as this fellow," Pete said, gesturing to Zachary with his glass, "or anyone as devoted to his wife. They're a testament to what love and hard work can build." Later, after the guests had left and the children were cleaning up, Zachary and Teresa slipped away to their bedroom. Teresa sat at her dressing table, removing the pins from her hair, and Zachary came up behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "You're beautiful," he said. "More beautiful than the day I married you." "You're biased," Teresa replied, but she was smiling. There were lines around her eyes now, threads of silver in her dark hair, but to Zachary she was as lovely as ever. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I'm also right." He began helping her with her hair, running his fingers through it in a gesture that was both practical and intimate. Teresa leaned back against him with a contented sigh. "We've built a good life, haven't we?" she said. "The best life," Zachary agreed. "Better than anything I could have imagined back when I was drifting." "Do you ever miss it?" Teresa asked. "The freedom, the open road?" Zachary considered the question. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he said honestly. "But I wouldn't trade what we have for anything. This life, with you and our children, it's worth more than all the freedom in the world." Teresa turned to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you so much," she said. "Thank you for stopping that night. Thank you for saving me." "You saved me too," Zachary replied. "I was just too stubborn to know I needed saving." They kissed, a soft and lingering connection that held all the years of their marriage, all the love and struggle and joy they'd shared. Outside, a winter wind was beginning to blow, but inside they were warm and safe and together. As the 19th century drew to a close and a new one loomed on the horizon, the Rawlings family continued to thrive. Thomas, at 18, announced his intention to marry Sarah Montgomery, a sweet-natured girl from a neighboring ranch. Mary, at 16, was being courted by the son of a Denver merchant who'd come to Fairplay for the summer. Joseph, at 13, was already talking about going to university, his mind hungry for knowledge that the small town couldn't provide. Zachary and Teresa watched their children grow into adults with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness that the years of having them all under one roof were coming to an end. But they took comfort in knowing they'd raised good people, children who were kind and hardworking and loved deeply. On a spring evening in 1899, Zachary found Teresa in the small cemetery at the edge of their property. She'd planted it years ago, marking the spot with a simple stone that bore the names of her parents and brother, even though their bodies had never been recovered. She came here sometimes, especially in the spring when wildflowers bloomed all around. Zachary stood beside her, not speaking, just being present. After a while, Teresa leaned against him. "I was telling them about Thomas's wedding plans," she said, "about Mary's beau, about Joseph's dream of becoming a teacher like I was. I like to think they can hear me, that they know about the life I've built." "I'm sure they can," Zachary said, "and I'm sure they're proud of you." "I hope so," Teresa replied. "I hope they know that I never forgot them, even while I was building a new life, that they're still a part of me." "They'll always be a part of you," Zachary said, "just like they're a part of our children through the stories you've told." Teresa nodded, blinking back tears. "It's strange," she said. 21 years since that terrible night, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to a different person." "In a way it did," Zachary said. "We're not the same people we were then. We've grown and changed. But the core of who we are, that stayed the same. They stood together in the cemetery as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a moment of quiet reflection, of honoring the past while acknowledging the present. Thomas's wedding took place in the summer of 1899, a joyous celebration that brought together families from all over the county. Watching his son stand at the altar, promising his life to the woman he loved, Zachary felt a profound sense of continuity. This was what it was all about, this passing of love from one generation to the next. During the reception, Zachary danced with Teresa, holding her close as a fiddler played a waltz. She fit perfectly in his arms the way she had for 20 years. "Our son's a married man now," she said. "I can hardly believe it." "I know," Zachary replied. "Seems like just yesterday I was teaching him to ride." "They grow up so fast," Teresa said with a sigh. "Soon Mary will be married, and then Joseph will go off to university, and it will just be the two of us again." "Is that such a terrible prospect?" Zachary asked with a smile. Teresa laughed. "Not terrible at all. We started out just the two of us after all. I think we can manage." "I think we can do more than manage," Zachary said. "I'm looking forward to it, actually, having you all to myself again." "Flatterer," Teresa said, but she was pleased. As predicted, Mary married her merchant's son in 1901, moving to Denver but visiting often. Joseph left for university in Boulder that same year, his letters home filled with excitement about his studies and the new world he was discovering. Zachary and Teresa found themselves alone in the ranch house for the first time in nearly 2 decades. It was an adjustment, the quiet after years of noise and activity, but they adapted. They took long rides together through the mountains, revisited the meadow where Zachary had first confessed his love, spent evenings reading aloud to each other by the fire. The ranch continued to prosper, though Zachary began to slow down a bit, letting Thomas take on more of the day-to-day work. He was in his mid-50s now, and while he was still strong, he could feel the years catching up to him. Teresa, in her early 40s, remained vibrant and energetic, her mind as sharp as ever. In 1903, they became grandparents for the first time when Thomas and Sarah welcomed a son. Holding the baby, looking down at the tiny face that was a perfect blend of his son and daughter-in-law, Zachary felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Another generation," Teresa said softly, standing beside him. "Our family continues." "Thanks to you," Zachary said. "If I hadn't found you that night, none of this would exist." "If you hadn't stopped," Teresa corrected. "You made a choice, Zachary. You could have ridden past, but you didn't. Everything that came after all of this, it's because you chose to be a good man." Zachary looked from the baby to his wife, this woman who had changed his entire life. "Best choice I ever made," he said. More grandchildren followed. Mary had twin girls in 1904, and Joseph, after finishing university and becoming a teacher as he dreamed, married and had a son in 1906. The ranch house that had seemed so quiet after the children left was now often filled with the sound of grandchildren laughing and playing. Zachary and Teresa embraced their roles as grandparents with joy. They told the children stories, taught them to ride, spoiled them in the way grandparents always do. And every time Teresa told one of the grandchildren about their great-grandparents and great-uncle who had died in a wagon accident, keeping their memory alive, Zachary felt a deep respect for her strength and her capacity for love. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the milestones of their growing family. The ranch remained successful, eventually being fully passed to Thomas as Zachary retired. Zachary and Teresa moved into a smaller house on the property, comfortable and cozy. perfect for two people in the autumn of their lives. In 1915, as the world descended into the madness of war across the ocean, Zachary and Teresa celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. They were in their late 60s and early 50s respectively, their hair white and silver, their faces lined with the years, but their love as strong as ever. They held the celebration at the big house, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Thomas gave a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke about his parents' enduring love and the example they'd set. "They taught us what it means to build a life together," Thomas said. "What it means to weather storms and celebrate joys, to hold tight to each other through everything. They're the foundation our whole family is built on." Later, as the party wound down, Zachary and Teresa walked back to their small house hand in hand. The path was familiar, worn smooth by years of their footsteps. Inside, they settled into their chairs by the fire, the same chairs they'd been sitting in for years. 36 years, Teresa said. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like no time at all." "I know what you mean," Zachary replied. "Either way, they've been the best years of my life." Teresa reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "Mine too. Even with all the grief at the beginning, even with all the hard times we've faced, I wouldn't change a thing. Not even the night by the river." Zachary asked quietly. Teresa was silent for a long moment, considering. "I'll always grieve for my family," she finally said. "That pain never completely goes away. But I've learned that grief and joy can exist side by side. I can miss them and still be grateful for what I found with you. If I could have both my family alive and you in my life, of course I would choose that. But that wasn't an option. And given the choices I actually had, the path I actually walked, I wouldn't change it." Zachary raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Teresa Rawlings. More than words can express." "I love you too, Zachary, always and forever." They sat together in companionable silence as the fire crackled and the night deepened outside. Through the window, they could see the mountains, those ancient sentinels that had watched over their love story from the beginning. Somewhere out there was the river where it had all started, still flowing cold and fast, still carrying snowmelt down from the heights. But Zachary and Teresa were here, warm and safe and together, surrounded by the family they'd built and the life they'd created. It was a good life, a full life, rich with love and meaning. As the years continued to advance, Zachary's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down that comes with age. His joints ached on cold mornings, he moved a bit slower, needed more rest. Teresa, nearly 20 years younger, remained relatively healthy, and she tended to him with the same devotion he'd shown her that long-ago night by the river. "I should be taking care of you," Zachary protested one morning as Teresa brought him breakfast in bed. "Hush," she said. "You took care of me when I needed it. Now it's my turn." That's what marriage is, Zachary, taking turns holding each other up. In the spring of 1918, Zachary fell ill with pneumonia. The doctor came from town, did what he could, but they all knew it was serious. Zachary was 72, and his body had been weakened by the hard life of a rancher and cowboy. Teresa barely left his side. She sat with him day and night, holding his hand, talking to him even when he was too weak to respond. Their children came, and their grandchildren, filling the small house with love and prayers. On a clear morning in May, with the mountains visible through the window and wildflowers blooming outside, Zachary opened his eyes and looked at Teresa. She was sitting beside the bed as she had been for days, and her face lit up when she saw him awake. "Hey there," she said softly, taking his hand. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Zachary admitted. His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but peaceful. "Are the kids here?" "They're in the other room," Teresa said. "Do you want to see them?" Zachary shook his head slightly. "In a minute, I want to talk to you first, just you." Teresa leaned closer, blinking back tears. "I'm here, I'm right here." "I need you to know," Zachary said, each word an effort, "that finding you that night, it was the beginning of my real life. Everything before that was just existing. You gave me purpose, love, a family. You gave me everything." "You gave me those things too," Teresa said, tears streaming freely now. "You saved my life, Zachary, in more ways than one." "Promise me something," Zachary said. "Promise me you'll keep living, really living. Don't shut yourself away in grief. You're still young, you have years ahead of you." "I promise," Teresa said, though the words nearly choked her. "But I'm going to miss you so much." "I'll miss you too," Zachary said. "But it's not goodbye forever, just goodbye for now. I'll be waiting for you whenever your time comes. Me and your family will all be there." He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "I love you, Teresa, more than life itself." "I love you too," Teresa whispered. "Thank you for stopping that night. Thank you for choosing to save me. Thank you for all of it." Zachary smiled, a peaceful expression settling over his features. "Best choice I ever made," he said, echoing words he'd spoken many times over the years. Teresa called for the children then, and they all gathered around the bed. Thomas held his father's other hand. Mary and Joseph stood at the foot of the bed, their own children clustered around them. They talked quietly, sharing memories and love, saying the things that needed to be said. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Zachary's breathing became shallower. Teresa held his hand and whispered the words she'd said to him for nearly 40 years. "I love you more today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow." Zachary's eyes met hers one last time, filled with a love that transcended words. Then, with his family surrounding him and his wife's hand in his, he took a final gentle breath and was gone. The grief was profound. Teresa felt like a part of her had been torn away, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. But she remembered her promise to Zachary and worked hard to keep it. She continued to live at the ranch, spending time with her children and grandchildren, keeping Zachary's memory alive through stories and love. She took comfort in the family they'd built together, in the legacy that would continue through generations. Every time she looked at one of her grandchildren, she saw pieces of Zachary in them, his strength and kindness passed down through the years. Teresa lived for another 15 years after Zachary's death, remaining active and engaged with her family and community. She saw her grandchildren grow and marry, welcomed great-grandchildren into the world. She never remarried, content with the love she'd had, knowing that nothing could compare to what she and Zachary had shared. On a spring morning in 1933, Teresa passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 75. Her children found her in her bed, a peaceful expression on her face, her hand resting on the pillow beside her as if reaching for someone. They buried her next to Zachary on the ranch they'd built together, under the mountains they'd both loved. The headstone reads simply, "Teresa Voss Rawlings, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, together again." The family gathered for the funeral, 4 generations strong. Thomas, now in his 50s, spoke about his parents' love story, about how his father had found his mother by the river and saved her life, how that single act of kindness had resulted in this entire family. "They taught us what real love looks like," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Not the easy kind of love, but the kind that chooses to stay through hard times, that builds a life one day at a time, that never gives up." Their love was a gift to all of us, and it's our responsibility to carry it forward. After the funeral, the family returned to the ranch house, that sturdy structure that Zachary had built with his own hands all those years ago. It still stood strong, filled now with the voices of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the life that two people had built together. In the small cemetery, as the sun set over the mountains, two headstones stood side by side. The wind whispered through the grass, and wildflowers swayed in the breeze, the same kind of wildflowers that had bloomed the night Zachary first found Teresa by the river. Their love story had begun with tragedy and a chance encounter on a frozen night. It had grown into something beautiful and enduring, a partnership that weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. They had built a life together from nothing, created a family that would span generations, loved each other with a devotion that never wavered. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the tragedy that brought them together, but the love they chose to build from it. Not the hardships they faced, but the way they faced them together. Not the years that separated their deaths, but the promise of reunion that waited beyond. The Rawlings ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family, each new generation hearing the story of how it all began. The story of a cowboy who stopped when he could have ridden past, who warmed a freezing girl by his fire and his heart, who chose love when he could have chosen loneliness. And if sometimes, on quiet spring evenings when wildflowers bloomed and the mountains stood sentinel in the distance, ranch hands reported seeing two figures walking hand in hand through the meadow, well, the family just smiled. Some love stories, they knew, didn't end with death. Some love stories lasted forever, echoing through the years, a reminder that kindness and love could create miracles. The small meadow where Zachary had first told Teresa he loved her became a special place for the family. Couples would go there to propose. Parents would take their children to tell them the story of their great-great-grandparents, and every anniversary of Zachary and Teresa's wedding, someone from the family would leave wildflowers there. The river where it all began still rang cold and fast, still carried snowmelt down from the mountains. But it was no longer just a river. It was the place where a love story began, where tragedy transformed into triumph, where one man's choice to stop and help a stranger in need created a legacy that would last for generations. Thomas ensured that the full story was written down and preserved, every detail his mother had shared about that night and all the years that followed. It became a family treasure, passed down alongside the ranch itself, a reminder of where they came from and the values that defined them. The last chapter of that written account, penned by Teresa herself a few years before her death, read, "If I could go back to that terrified girl lying by the river, frozen and alone, having just lost everything, I would tell her this: your story isn't over. The worst night of your life is about to become the beginning of your greatest love. A man is coming, a good man with a kind heart, and he's going to save you in more ways than one. You'll build a life together that's richer and fuller than anything you could imagine. You'll have children and grandchildren. You'll know love that sustains you through every hardship, and you'll never be alone again. The river takes, but sometimes, if you're very lucky, it also brings you exactly where you need to be." Below that, in Zachary's hand, added during one of the times he'd read her words, was a simple note. "And if I could go back to that drifter riding through the cold, I'd tell him to pay attention because he's about to meet the woman who will make his whole life make sense. Don't ride past. Stop. Look closer. Because lying by that river is your future, your heart, your home. Everything you've been searching for without knowing it is right there, waiting for you to be brave enough to stop and help. The best decision you'll ever make is just moments away." Their story became legend in Fairplay and the surrounding areas. The tale of the cowboy and the freezing girl, of love born from tragedy, of a life built on compassion and devotion. Parents told it to their children as a bedtime story. Couples invoked it when they needed to remember why they'd chosen each other. It became woven into the fabric of the community, a touchstone of hope and love. And so, as the years rolled on and the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the legacy of Zachary and Teresa Rawlings endured. The ranch, though modernized, remained in family hands. The meadow, the river, the small cemetery, all were lovingly maintained. And the story, that beautiful story of fire and heart, of cold transformed to warmth, of loneliness becoming love, lived on. Because some stories are too important to forget, some love is too powerful to fade. And some moments, like a cowboy stopping on a frozen night to help a stranger, change not just individual lives but echo through generations. A reminder that choosing kindness, choosing to help, choosing love, can create something that lasts forever. In the end, Zachary and Teresa's love story was exactly what Thomas had said at his mother's funeral. A gift. A gift to their family, to their community, to anyone who heard it and remembered that even in our darkest moments, even when we've lost everything, love can find us. Hope can warm us. And a single act of compassion can be the beginning of something beautiful beyond measure. That was the true legacy of that frozen night by the river. Not just a family or a ranch or even a great love story, though it was all of those things. The real legacy was the reminder that we all have the power to change someone's life, that we all have moments where we can choose to stop or keep riding, to help or look away, to open our hearts or keep them closed. And that choosing love, always choosing love, is never the wrong decision.